Hello and welcome to this GarrettCom training presentation on how to set up VLANs on a GarrettCom switch. Now we've logged into the Graphical User Interface on the GUI on a 6K25E switch, and on the left hand side we have the configuration menu. If we expand out the configuration menu and navigate to the bottom, we can see a section for VLANs. If we expand out this section and expand out the tagged base VLAN section below it, gives us three menus where we can view and make changes to our VLAN configuration. The first and most important is the settings menu, and this is where we'll be spending most of the time during this video. If I navigate to Word, we can see a table of what we're trying to achieve. Now we have 5 columns. The first is the VLAN number, second is the VLAN name, the third column is what ports belong to that VLAN, the fourth column is whether those ports connect to end devices or whether those ports connect to another switch. Now the first row we have is VLAN number 1. Now VLAN number 1 is the default VLAN. Now, every single port on a switch belongs to the default VLAN by default. It's just, if you like, the standard basic setup. Now, in this particular situation, we don't have anything in the ports to end devices columns and the ports to other switches columns, because with the default VLANs we're not adding any tags. All traffic which is sent and received on ports in the default VLAN are sent and received untagged. Now, the purpose of a tag is to identify what VLAN a frame belongs to. And the reason we are separating these two columns out into ports which connect to end devices, and by end devices I mean any device which is not another switch, or not another device running 802.1q. So common end devices would be PCs, IP cameras, IP phones, even servers. If you're connecting the switch, if the port is used to connect the switch to another switch, that's a different port. Because the reason it's different is because we're adding the tags to frames which are sent on those ports, and the other switch is expecting to receive a frame with a tag which identifies what VLAN it belongs to. Any frames received by a switch which are sent by another switch which don't have those tags applied to is assumed to belong to the default VLAN. And it's important we recognize the significance of that, because various types of traffic, such as our spanning tree protocol traffic, needs to go around the network without any tags being applied to it. But as we get further into configuration, this will make more and more sense. So the first thing to note is that we have VLAN 1, all ports are part of VLAN 1 by default, and frames are not tagged at all. It's an untagged VLAN. Below that we have 3 other VLANs, VLAN 10, VLAN 20 and VLAN 30 for IP cameras, IP phones, PCs. These are just arbitrary names. You can name your VLANs whatever you want. So it's best to name them something meaningful, something that on your specific network you would understand the purpose of that VLANs and what that grouping is. Now the ports in that VLAN are listed here. It's important that we list every single port which is in that VLAN, and it's important that we recognize that any port which connects from one switch to another switch, in this case ports 23 and 24, they need to be members of every single VLAN so that they can add the labels, add the tags to those VLANs. If a tagging port a port which connects one switch to another switch, a port which is adding tags to the frames before they're sent, and reading those tags when they're received. If it's not a member of that VLAN, it can't add the tags for that VLAN. So a common mistake is not to include the tagging ports in every VLAN. And you can see here we have ports 23 and 24 in all three of our VLANs. And we can see here we've also listed again specifically that ports 23 and 24 are ports which go to other switches. So if you follow out this table when you're designing your VLANs, it's very difficult to go wrong, because if you list out ports in the VLAN, basically all the ports which belong to it, and then define them out as to ports which connect to end devices and ports which connect to other switches, then it's a nice methodology, if you like, on how to set up VLANs without any hassles. We start with VLAN 10, which only has one end device in it. Then we go to VLAN 20 and then to VLAN 30, progressively adding more and more end devices to the VLANs. But the important thing to note is that the ports which connect one switch to another switch, which connect this switch to its neighbouring switches, will always be 23 and 24 in this particular example. So let's go ahead and let's set up our first VLAN. I'm going to go back to the GUI, and here we can clearly see that we got straight off the bat one VLAN, the default VLAN, and it has all ports as members of that VLAN. And we can also see that it says tagged, it says no, which is what we want. We want to have at least one VLAN going around the network which is not adding or removing frames. And that's important so that our spanning tree protocol can work properly. What I would suggest is just leave the default VLAN alone. If you just add the additional VLANs you want, as I will demonstrate in this video, everything will be fine. If you start removing VLAN 1, then you need to add in another VLAN which is untagged so that the spanning tree can work properly. Okay, so enough theory, let's start with the practical. Step number 1 is to basically turn on the capability on a switch to use VLANs. So currently the VLAN status is disabled. We want to click on this box and select enabled. Step number 1, done. Step number 2 is to go down to the add button, and we're going to add in the VLANs we want to have. So the first VLAN is, let's go to our table. The first VLAN we need to add is number 10. That's for IP cameras. And we'll deal with these final two columns later date. So VLAN 10, IP camera, and ports 10, 23 and 24. So VLAN ID is number 10, VLAN name is, let's just copy and paste that. And we want to have ports number 10, 23 and 24. So we're going to go down to the list here, we've got port number 10. Click on the box. Go all the way down to ports 23 and 24. Sometimes it's easy to make a mistake and click the wrong box. So for example, I think I'm clicking on port 23, but I'm not. If I look across, that's port 22. So in order to prevent that, just click on the name you want to add in, and it gives you a nice sort of red indicator all the way across, so you know exactly which box you're checking. You want 23 and 24. Click OK, and that's done. Very straightforward. We created a new VLAN, number 10. Name is IP cameras. We've got ports number 10, 23 and 24. 10 will be the port which connects to our end device, and ports 23 and 24 will be the ports which connect this switch to adjacent switches. And those ports are important because we'll be adding tags to messages or frames sent from one switch to the next, so that the the adjacent switch, the switch which is next to this one, will know which VLAN that frame belongs to. Okay. So that's fairly straightforward. If we go to add again, this time we're going to go VLAN 20. Back to our table, we know VLAN 20 is for IP phones. Don't worry about this management enabled option just yet. We'll come back to that in a bit. Now we need to say, well, we want port 16, 20. We want ports number 16, and we want ports number 20. And it's easy to make a mistake and go OK now, but remember we need to add in the inter-switch ports, the tagging ports to every VLAN, so 23 and 24. And here we can see again, VLAN 20, it's called IP phones. The ports which belong to it are 16, 20, 23 and 24. 16, 20, 23 and 24. Okay. Go back to add. The last one we need to add in is number 30. The name for this one, let's go back to our table. It's PCs. You don't have to copy and paste, you can just type them in. And let's go back to our table, and we know that ports 7, 8, 11. Ports number 7, 8, 11. 17, 23 and 24, 17, 23 and 24 are all members of this VLAN. Click OK, and there we are. We've had our VLANs created, and we've assigned all the ports to that VLAN which need to be in that VLAN. So it's important to note at this point, for example, that port number 7 is a member of VLAN 30 and a member of VLAN 1. That's perfectly fine. There's no problem with that at all. It's also worth noting that ports 23 and 24 are members of VLAN 1, 10, 20 and 30, because if they're not members of all VLANs, then they can't add tags as needed for each of those VLANs. So we must clearly mark out which ports are going to connect this switch to the adjacent switches, and make sure those ports are members of every VLAN. Okay. Next step is to deal with our end devices. Now, do you remember I said that there was VLAN 1 created by default, and all ports were member of that default VLAN by default. Now, what's special about the default VLAN is there's no tags being added or removed to the frames as they're sent from one switch to the next switch. Now, in order when a switch receives an untagged frame, a frame without a tag on it, so there's nothing to identify which VLAN that frame belongs to, that message belongs to. The switch needs to know what VLAN to put that frame into by default. So if I don't know what VLAN that frame belongs to, I need to know what my default option is. By default it belongs to number 1. By default it belongs to number 10. Now it's important to note that port number 10 is a member of VLAN 10, so when an end device sends a frame to the switch, it's going to arrive in on port number 10, and the switch is going to go, okay, alright, if you arrived on port number 10 and you don't have a tag, which you don't, you're going to belong to VLAN 10 by default. Okay. So what we need to do here is we need to go to the port settings, because we're configuring specifics relating to a particular port. Here we've got port list. We need to delete that out, and we need to type in the port we want to configure. In this case, we want to configure it as port number 10, and we just need to specify the default VLAN for that port. In this case, it's number 10, and click OK. Alright, let's go to VLAN number 20. In VLAN number 20 we have two end device ports, ports number 20 and port number 16. Actually, in fact, if I just convert that back around, so port number 16 and port number 20. These ports connect to end devices. Frames which are sent and received on these ports do not have any tags on them, because tagging is a switching protocol. It's understood by switches. That's a bit of a broad statement, but generally it's true. You can get network cards which understand tagging, so you can have servers which understand tagging and can behave as switches, and also routers can understand tagging as well, so that you can link a switch to a router. But generally speaking, end devices don't understand tagging, the 802.1q protocol, because it's a switching protocol, it's a switching thing. Okay, so any frames sent or received on a port which connects to an end device don't have tags applied, so you need to tell the switch what VLAN that frame belongs to. When it receives a VLAN, a frame on that port, by default it's going to belong to VLAN 10, or by default it's going to belong to VLAN 20. So let's do that now. So let's go back to the port settings. Let's configure ports 16 and port 20. And we're going to say that on any frame received on this port is going to belong to VLAN 20. Click OK. And the last one is to go to ports 7, 8, 11 and 17. So port settings, just copy and paste that in. Ports 7, 8, 11 and 17, and by default these will belong to VLAN 30. Click OK, and that's done. Now we've got one final column which indicates our final job. Now on the ports which connect to on one switch to the next switch, remember we said these are adding the tags to identify what VLAN the frames belong to. We need to go back to port settings again, and here we need to type in 23 and 24, because we're configuring ports 23 and 24. We need to have a comma between each number, by the way, just to note that. We've already dealt with the default ID. We're going to leave this as 1 on ports 23 and 24, because all ports belong to VLAN 1 by default. We want to keep the tagging ports assigned to VLAN 1 as well, so that any untagged frames which arrive on those ports are assumed to belong to VLAN 1. Let's leave it as that. That works perfectly fine for us. We don't need to change anything there. The filter status we'll talk about later. But here we have tagging control. So basically what we want to do here is we want to go that ports 23 and 24 are going to be tagging for number 10. So status is tagged, and click OK. Let's go back to port settings again. 23, 24. We're also going to tag for VLAN 20 and change it from untagged to tagged again. So 23 and 24 will be tagging control for ID number 20, and we're going to be adding tags. And finally 23 and 24 will also be adding tags for VLAN 30 tagged. Here we can see that for VLANs 10, 20 and 30 we're adding tags yes, yes and yes. For VLAN 1 we're adding tags no we're not. If you want to edit who belongs to what VLAN, you can click on the pencil. You can add and remove member ports here. If you want to delete a VLAN entirely, you can click on the X. But bear in mind, if the VLANs are up and running, you'll have to turn them off before you can delete them or edit them. So we also have an option here for join and leave, but we'll come back. We don't really need to use that, to be honest. So what we did, just to recap, is we came in and we enabled VLANs we added the VLAN specifying the end device ports and the tagging ports. For every single port we specified the default ID and whether or not that port will be tagging and for which VLAN it will be tagging for. Bear in mind this tagging part is only important for tagging ports, so in this particular example ports 23 and 24. You don't have to set this for ports which connect to end devices, you can leave this alone. Likewise, you can also leave alone the default ID for any tagging ports. So for end device ports we set this option here, and for tagging ports we set this option here. The final thing we need to do is go to status, select all VLANs and start those VLANs and click OK. Now we can see the status is changed to active. And that completes, I think what I'll do is that's the basic setup of how to set up VLANs using the Graphical User Interface. What I'll do in the next video is show you some more of the miscellaneous topics surrounding the VLANs, because I don't want to add too much to this video. The core things are to enable them, add the VLANs you want, noting the end device ports and the inter-switch ports for tagging ports. For the end device ports we specify the default ID in the port settings, and for the tagging ports we specify what VLANs they're going to be tagging for. The final step is to go to status and select them all and start them all. As I said, it's best to have a simple table like this: the VLAN number, what you want to call that VLAN, what ports belong to that VLAN, including the end device ports and the end device port and the inter-switch ports, detailing them specifically which ones are the end devices to remind you to set the defaults, and detailing specifically again one of the inter-switch ports so it reminds you that for each VLAN you need to tag on these ports. So this table also serves as an additional reminder. Okay, so that completes this training video. As I said, on the next video I'll talk about some of the miscellaneous and the advanced topics, sort of editing and security features surrounding VLANs. I hope this has been interesting for you, I hope it's been helpful, and on behalf of GarrettCom I'd like to thank you for your time. Goodbye.